April 1995. In the Balkans, the UN was carrying out airstrikes. The Serbians fought the Croatians. Bosnia was fought in, and stuck in between. All in all, it would be a bloody tapestry of ethnically charged battles that would make up this year. The same to see some of the worst atrocities committed. More than 6 separate operations by various sides would be carried out. Meanwhile, across the world in Rwanda, Paul Kagame's RPF had taken Kigali and most of the country. The genocide was ended, but they had inherited a deeply bloody and scarred land. The Interahamwe had slipped into the Congo and would begin their raids. The tragedy was not over, and the United Nations' failing of understanding and preventing the genocide in both these conflicts would stain them permanently. It was clear that even though in the West, it had been a time of relative peace and easiness, but even after 2 world wars, even after the fall of the USSR, the last to challenge the Allies and especially the US, war had not disappeared, and the evils it held had also not dissipated. As someone who grew up in the shadow of this time, the images of far-off wars in Africa and Eastern Europe are news headlines I remember clearly. Even without knowing what was going on, it was pictures of places I still remember. As I grew older, there became an urge to put these pieces together. After all, what could so many have suffered for so long for? Well, where I lived, I had the blessing of never hearing artillery, machine guns, and fighter jets. I remember reading my first newspapers when I was around perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Initially, I just wanted to read the comics in the back. But before too long, I could see that there was a bigger picture. If one kept reading, one could slowly piece together the world that existed far beyond where I could see. This haunted me for years. Finally, when I was around 16 or 17, I read some old magazines. Printed many years earlier, they were the first clues for putting the pieces together. It would take much longer, many hours of documentaries, books, and footage to figure it all out. But something was unquestionably there. I enjoy Ace Combat Zero for many reasons, but perhaps the thing I love most, the thing that still resonates with me, is how much it perfectly responds to this time. It's a game that could have easily done a simplistic approach, but it instead went basically back to the beginning, and was the first game since 3 that not only tackled a complex war, it did so phenomenally well. Before we begin to dive into those elements, it is still a game, and I want to get the gameplay improvements right out of the way. Ace Combat Zero is still probably my favorite in regards to pure game feel. The tight, responsive controls of 5 are here given a plethora of complementary improvements that work together fantastically well. The boring, heightened health on units has been thankfully dropped. Return lines as well have returned, and they make a larger mission obviously much better. In terms of new elements that improve the gameplay, the bore sight is a great addition. Being able to specifically pick targets from a group instead of relying on cycling through them is very useful, and it's a straight upgrade. Related to this is the shoot indicator, and it's another welcome addition. The small indicator here takes the additional guesswork out of firing off missiles. It lets you know exactly when you are putting yourself in the correct position to nail a target. All of this makes for Ace Combat Zero's flight model to be one of the most enjoyable. It's sharp and reactive. Gone are Ace Combat 5's sloggy repetitive strikes on damage-sponged targets. Ace Combat Zero perhaps very smartly did something else. It took what Ace Combat 5 had set up, a USSR and USA versus Germany in 1995, and more or less completely reworked it. The World War II analogy is gone. Yuktobania is completely gone save for a few small references. The conflict is squarely between Belka and the rest of the Ocean countries around them. I mentioned the Balkan connections in the beginning, and it's especially true here. The Belka Nazi Germany paper-thin analogy is gone. It still has bits of it present in it, machines, form, and its language, but Ace Combat Zero's Belka is one infused with much more than simply being another Germany stand-in. It has elements of Prussia with its military focus on dominance and tradition, the mythology of medieval England and France. In the way Belka disintegrates in the wake of economic collapse, it's very much imbued with the 90s breakup of Yugoslavia. As I mentioned in my Ace Combat 4 video, Strange Reel has the wonderfully open possibility of taking bits from our world and remixing them to tell a unique story. Gone is Ace Combat 5's otherwise simplistic choice for a setting. Here instead, we have a story of economic instability leading to balkanization. Ace Combat 5's simplistic moralization is likewise gone. Secondary sources heavily imply Osea was, in part, behind the collapse and breakup of Belka. For the first time since Ace Combat 3, a morally grey war has become the focus of our journey. In truth, there really was no other option. The conflicts of the 90s were simply too complex, too violent, and too messy to try to simplify. I want to be explicitly clear, moral grayness does not mean moral relativism. The wars had genuinely positive actors who worked or at least tried to decrease human suffering, and those who certainly did the opposite. That is to say, to pull from this time period and then try to flatten it down into a story of absolute good guys and absolute bad guys in a simple World War II analogy would be treading down Ace Combat 5's mistaken direction. But here I really do want to compliment Ace Combat Zero. Not only did it experiment with and succeed in creating variation from Ace Combat 2's and 4's template, it simultaneously made a story about a more complex war in less time, with less talking than 5. The story of Ace Combat Zero is, without saying, one of my favorites. When we start, our battles are ostensibly a familiar territory. We are fighting off the enemy's attempts to crush us, when we fight to push back into the forces of Belka. It's more or less a just war against an aggressor much larger, carried out not even by those nations' militaries, but by whatever mercenary forces they can gather up for their defense. This is how desperate they are. But after that, it becomes more and more clear the Allies are perhaps not just in fighting to remove Belka's war potential. The impression I get in this story is not one of a literal logic of the real world, but one of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or its fantastic movie adaptation Apocalypse Now, of a journey into the heart of madness brought on by war. The fact Osea might have actively helped Belka's descent towards war especially makes this aggressive push into Belka even more so questionable. I will touch on nukes later, but if Osea had had a nuclear arsenal, then they could have ended the war with nuclear threats from day one. The fact they didn't leads me to be very suspicious. The breaching of the Futuro Canal is clearly inspired by the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, where the British-Israeli forces attacked the Egyptians who had tried to assert control on it. The idea of a local conservative state trying to take a vital supply line only to be driven off. Flicker of Hope draws both historical reference from the 101 Airborne Division, as well as the town's name, Solus Ortus, meaning sunrise, an allusion perhaps to the time the mission takes place at. Diazepam, however, marks the turning point here clearly. Its meaning, a grand burst of harmony, or sound, reflects the exaltation of the people of Directus, that their nation will not be absorbed by Belka. However, it can also be interpreted as the last crescendo or warm-up of the initial just war we fight in. The original Greek, diapason chordon, to travel across the musical chords. We have finished our clear initial small war. We were blatantly a force of good for the people of Ustio. But our actions in liberating Ustio were successful. The conflict, though, is not over. From here on, we move up the river into the mists of moral grayness and confusion. Like many things, it's a very clever name with many meanings that all contribute towards the tone and theme of Ace Combat Zero. Operation Hellbound is the moment that we go over the cliff and into the precipice. Under the guise of a nuclear inspection, we are in essence invading Belka. The Allies have figured out an excuse for justifying a campaign which will let them cut into Belka, more or less gut it, and take its resources permanently. This is also the point where King Arthur and his surrounding mythology starts to push into Ace Combat Zero. Gladison is the name of the horrible demon serpent in that mythology. King Pellinor abandons his kingdom to forever hunt that beast, tragically chasing it into his old age, likely never returning home. The illusion here I take away is pretty clear. We have saved our kingdom of Ustio, but both us and the Allies have not opted to rest. Instead, we will continue to hunt down the Belkans doggedly, regardless of the consequences. The use of mythology here is an entire other thing. I could do a whole video on just the Arthurian connections in Ace Combat Zero. In comparison, in Ace Combat 5, what is the function of Razgriz? Ultimately, to what end does it serve? Excuse the fact that we are genocidal pacifists? This logic would mean I could go to England and start beheading people with a claymore, and when the police show up I could simply say, "Don't worry, I'm just King Arthur. I've returned from my long slumber." Ultimately, Razgriz serves as simply another variation of a stupid Chosen One prophecy, an excuse. In Ace Combat Zero, however, it's yet another thing that is done much better. Here the mythology and the chivalry of knights and King Arthur directly adds to a layer of stylish coolness. It amplifies the world and the complexity and the plot. Yes, modern fighter jet pilots are sort of like knights, an elite fighting force. The idea of chivalry and air warfare connects with the early World War I biplane pilots and their very personal battles above the trenches. On a narrative level, it's a cool connection because it's taking King Arthur, something culturally present well before jet fighters, and weaving together both. Perhaps later I will do that video, but for now I will simply say it adds a wonderful particular flavor to Ace Combat Zero, an otherwise modern war setting that really makes it feel special. To some, this was a war of clashing knights, holding to their ideals, and not some economically motivated modern conflict. As a small side note, there is something delightful about a game where jet pilots are proverbial knights, in which we not only joust with, but destroy windmills in a country more or less acting as a strange real equivalent of Spain. For now though, we move on. As a second fantastic aspect of style, for the first time since Ace Combat 3, a definitive stylistic choice has been really woven in. The little hints of guitar that 4 had here bloom fully into a flamenco explosion. This choice is honestly one of those you perhaps don't think meshes in your mind, but it works amazing in practice. Blue Submarine No. 6 taught me that upbeat jazz and submarines can go together fantastically. Ace Combat Zero completely convinced me that in a tense jet dogfight, flamenco fits arguably even better than the Top Gun rock and roll most associate with jet fighters. The mirroring of the spinning dramatic but controlled music of flamenco with the equally dramatic controlled spinning dance of jet planes, it works very well. While not every track is absolutely perfect, its presence is unmistakable. As soon as you hear the first few strums of Zero, you know you are listening to one of the best boss themes and arguably the best final level theme in Ace Combat. Returning to our journey, we keep fighting into Belkan territory. We push into Belka. Eventually we are attacked by Excalibur. Checking off 1, a really cool Arthurian reference, and 2, probably one of my favorite representations of a realistic laser installation in fiction. It's also one of the most enjoyable big set pieces in Stonehenge, in that its laser actually makes a solid threat players need to keep in mind. It follows the correct formula as well, a mission of tight restriction, then a satisfactory mission of removing it. We make our second outing into the stage of the Round Table. At some point, I will go over Area 88 and all of its influences on the series, as this is a game, for sure, that has several strong ones. Perhaps my favorite part of this mission lies in PJ idealistically talking about peace, a line that would have been serious in Ace Combat 5 and not out of place. But here, Pixy rightly calls out as nothing more than a hypocritical idealism. This is also the point where the other pilot characters hint they may be growing tired of this prolonged war. After this comes Inferno, a mission with obvious allusions to the firebombings of Dresden, or Japan. The city's name is Hoffnung, which translates as hope. Here, combined with the obvious reference of Inferno, points pretty squarely to Dante's Divine Comedy in the famous line, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." But hope for what? Well, Operation Hellbound was pretty much bluntly us moving out of the sunshine just war, down into the moral grayness river. Now with Hoffnung, we have more or less arrived, and Pixy is certainly disliking it. It is a dramatic burning city, and us being blatantly destructive while the Belkans destroy all they can before retreating. For a night mission, it's very dramatic, which as some of my favorites, it stands out for sure. Diazepam was our fixed farewell to just war. Hoffnung was the Allies clearly enacting retaliatory strategic bombings, but the nuclear detonation is the point where Pixy has just had enough. The war has become horrific, and Pixy's moral framework fails. He can no longer justify it, and turns. Many people seem to take this as an absurd thing to do. If you have nukes and your conventional armies are losing, you don't have long-range ICBMs and hit their cities with, but you do have aircraft to deliver them. Yes, you nuke them at a defensive choke point, like the Waldreich Mountains. Belka as a nation at this point is more or less defeated, but the battle continues. We have arrived at the final arc of the game, a world with no boundaries, and it's time for me to talk around the thing that makes Ace Combat Zero fantastic no longer. We have arrived at one of the core elements I love about this game, as well as one which I think is very misunderstood. The Ace style system. Many people don't get it. Critics do not get it. Ace Combat fan, who I otherwise find annoying, made a video I absolutely hate in which he pretty much ignores the point of it in favor of fawning over Ace Combat 5. Much like Ace Combat 3's ending, I will here be absolutely blunt. The Ace style system is not a moral choice system. As well, it's not an alternate timeline system either. Ace Combat Zero's Ace style system is entirely about the interpretation of war, our personal approach to that. Now you might question, what does this mean? So here, I'll go into depth. These three orientations are of 1. A war based on rules, war with formality and honor. 2. A war based on absolute execution and totality of strength above all. And in between, those who understand war as a place of flexibility, compromise, and adaptability. I say again, this is not a moral choice. To explain why, I'll have to go into detail on each, and a bit of history. The knight approach is just that. War must be done and should be done according to rules, chivalry, regulation. The samurai bushido. War is about respect and honor. Naturally to us, this sounds like the good guys, right? Rules and regulations sound like something to put our minds at ease in the world of death and chaos that is war, a system to protect the weak and to make sure the strong do their job. But think for a moment. Historically, knights and samurai were plenty capable of exercising cruelty perfectly fine. If anything, their hard rules let them kill even easier, as it meant that they could morally justify death and murder as being subservient to a higher power and system of rules. Abraham Lincoln, in his time, was practically cursed with such thinking. His early generals were not uneducated, but their education was from the famous West Point. Their teachings were based on Napoleon's ideas of discipline, maths, and engineering, and of particular note, honor. Modern war could be clean and be made of a small number of climactic battles. There would be no deaths of civilians, and there would be no unnecessary casualties. These ideas sound naturally appealing, but in practice, people went out to picnic and watched the battle, and what happened? The first battle of Bull Run was host to 30,000 Union men. The largest at that point assembled in North America, and they lost, along with nearly 2,000 lives. Major General Irvin McDowell was replaced by George B. McClellan, who took command afterwards. He organized a force of 70,000 men, and then did not move. Why engage in dirty strategic battles? Why pursue smaller, weaker enemy forces? When all you need to do was wait for your single massive, honorable fight. In the end, it would take years for Lincoln to finally find pragmatic generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, who could enact the brutal but effective war-making which would ultimately end the conflict. This is the crux of Knight. The rules we put in place for war ultimately might not prevent cruelty. Likewise, the less efficiently we enact war, the longer we may end up prolonging it. World War I, much like the Civil War, is a tragic joke in this vein, the punchline of which is millions of gallons of human blood. This takes us to the extreme opposite, the mercenary style. The name alone says it all. War is about efficiently and brutally destroying the enemy as quickly as possible. No higher ordeals or rules to hold back unrestricted total war. This is by definition a war that is unrestrained in terms of the weapons used, the territory or combatants involved, or the objectives pursued, especially one in which the laws of war are disregarded. It's naturally appealing to us in the opposite way. Why respect the enemy? Why restrict? Our natural human instincts practically scream at us to take revenge. If they will harm us to death, we will not recognize them as human. But obviously history has shown us that this is also a horrific choice. General Georgy Zhukov saw no need to respect the Germans. After all, they had attacked and caused the death of millions of Soviet troops and civilians. They were actual Nazis. They were brutal. So why should the Soviet troops relent? What came of this though? More rape, more destruction, more pillaging, and more death. It leads to something I call the Black Spiral, a cycle of hatred which can only be born when two forces unremittingly hate each other. If you've ever wondered why Europe has so many old grudges and had so many wars, this is your answer. Hateful destruction is ultimately most damaging as well for the period after the war, because what happens? Things need to be rebuilt physically. Fighting a war to capture a pile of ashes means you basically got nothing for how much blood and effort you burned doing so. But mentally, societally, these scars can last decades, hundreds, even thousands of years. Outliving human lives born into hate so old, it's now simply part of the culture. In the Balkans, the hatred born from the Turkish occupation prior manifested itself as genocidal hatred against the Bosnians, a group who genetically and culturally were more Balkan than they ever were Turkish. In Rwanda, Paul Kagame more or less had to instate anti-racial laws to ban the discrimination of Tutsi against Hutu and vice versa. Even though the majority Hutu RPF won their war to retake Rwanda, the bloodshed by the previous Tutsi government that had slaughtered Hutu had left the country fundamentally shocked. Paul Kagame's reaction of not enabling a counter-genocide, of taking a stance of forgiveness and healing, avoided feeding into the Black Spiral. Even Grant, who I just praised before, had his march to the sea. While nowhere as bad as the previous two examples, it still hurt. It still enacted retaliatory looting and destruction. Lincoln's tragic assassination, combined with agitation by elements like the Daughters of the South, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, would make sure that scar never healed. Though it has gone dormant at times, it's a wound which still lives on. Lastly, between the two, is the path perhaps very, very suitably simply called Soldier. I don't have as much to say beyond that this is perhaps my favorite. This approach to war is probably our closest to modern approaches. War should have limitations, things like the Geneva Convention should be respected, but attempting to cater to ideals and romanticism about war betray their ability to actually carry it out. There is no absolute approach that can work. War must be conducted in a state of adaptive consideration. All of these paths, however, are canon. Cipher shot down all of the aces, because all of these kinds of wars have happened. If anything contradicts, it's exactly because people's stories of war contradict. Vile invaders and treacherous rebels are loyal soldiers depending on who you ask. Was it really sabotage, or an excuse to begin a war? Some things are certain, but others have as many answers as people present on the battlefield. Now I talked very long, but Pixy ultimately sums it up here somewhat pessimistically, but all too well. According to Pixy, the aces who fly for their pride are the knights who use honorable war for their egos. The aces who fly for strength are the mercenaries who only care about being the strongest and crushing their enemy absolutely. And the aces who can read the tide of battle are the soldiers who can flexibly know when to take strategic advantage and when to restrain from destruction. Hence, why attaining that middle rank is so hard. Pixie's cynicism here is well founded, but I'll get into that in a bit. In the end, none of these frames of understanding and for fighting in war are perfect or 100% foolproof. In terms of gameplay, I love this because it basically means you have an elegant and beautiful solution to replayability. Not just 3 playthroughs, but so many different versions of the story can be told. Are you an honorable pilot who casts off their morals and descends into brutal killing? Are you a heartless mercenary who rises to honor in the face of a brutal war? This idea of many stories resonates with me so much. To me, it's honestly one of the most unique approaches to war in a video game I've ever seen. In another game, the bombing of Hoffnung would be a moral twist, where the obvious good guys have become an obvious, simple bad guy. But here it's left up to interpretation of the audience. Wonderfully, you can interpret the attack as either a justifiable execution of total war against a target producing munitions for the war, or an overkill, retaliatory attack, which we can apply the same criticisms of real life's unrestricted bombing campaigns. Something many still argue over for its use in World War II and Vietnam. How useful was it? How justifiable was it? God knows when we do more or less the same thing in Ace Combat 5. In Four Horsemen, it's not nearly as demonized or questioned. Really, the reason I love this is because it reminds me so much of watching all those history documentaries. When you see real war history, you realize clean, perfect, simple stories do not exist. Ace Combat 5's simplistic approach is a childish narrative. It's a fairy tale in and of itself. When I watch documentaries on the wars, I would watch all the documentaries from the BBC and from Western sources. Then, I would look up subtitled Serbian documentaries. It became clear that war really is not this easily understood story, but a tapestry of many lives and their narratives. Some events are very absolute, some people are morally and ethically bankrupt, no question. But some stories and facts change depending on who you ask. War and history is made of hundreds of these drops that fill up an ocean of experience. They shift and change depending on who tells them, what nation supports them, how much time has passed. Cipher, as well, is such a perfect reaction. Blaze is what you get when you try to make something like an anonymous main character in a power fantasy and then try to squeeze them down into some kind of mortal human form. It creates an awkward human skin-wearing Grim Reaper. Cipher is perfect because he, or rather it, is the opposite. The name says it all. Cipher is a decryptor, something used to make sense of a complicated code. Here, the name makes perfect sense because as we play, we as Cipher decode the Balkan War, making a story and attaining an understanding of the events. We play the game, make our choices for which framework we decide on, and then see that choice reflected in the bosses we face and their reactions. Really, I love the interviews so much. The framework of investigating a previous war is really fucking genius. It works, and it meshes so well with so many other concepts. Interviews in the future don't need to show Cipher. They don't need to show him being a human. It also shows that many stories can make up war. It keeps Cipher as a mythical entity embodying war itself and its understanding in all its variations. After all, the interviews show the survivors, and those who survive ultimately end up shaping how war is understood. What you do as the player in Cipher's shoes is a mirror to how they recall the war in gameplay. The aces you face are presented so stylishly and coolly. In the end, all of them were shot down by you because all of them fought in the war. All of them dealt with it. Their introductions alone mean that even if the fight itself ends up being not too difficult, its presentation still hits you. The fact you see them afterwards as well, it's really one of the best lessons of Yellow 13, of building up enemy squadrons to be more than just a boss fight, to be something expressing the tone and themes of Ace Combat 0. Nowhere else does it quite get this good. Ace Combat 3 probably gets the closest, and has the enemy pilots functioning more as distinct characters. It's not bad, and they do work well within its themes for sure. Yellow 13 is solid, but it's Ace Combat 4, so it's very simple. It's very open to interpretation. The rest, they are lucky to get to 4's level, and most get nowhere close. Beyond just the videoed aces, the assault records are phenomenal. This is another straight improvement Ace Combat 0 does, taking the various one-off aces who you would casually just hunt down for the challenge and the skins, and then giving them each a tiny piece of the story to tell. It's another small part that is wonderfully polarized towards the goal of the game. In the end, this is one of the cores. Cipher is what happens if you take Ace Combat's main character and push them away from a mortal human and towards a concept, an idea. I think it will surprise no one when I say between Cipher and Nemo, I could probably not pick a favorite. As I mentioned him already, I should talk as well about Pixy. Larry Foulke, solo wing Pixy. Even the cheesy dubbed acting doesn't diminish how much I like him. If Cipher is the path to choosing which version of war you want to understand, Pixy's story is one of a pilot thrilled at freeing a nation and at what he achieved while fighting, who is then confronted by the vile destruction of war. So what is his choice? He, like all those members of A World with No Boundaries, he has made the ultimate choice, not to be a pacifist in Ace Combat 5's foolish simplicity, but to take war and to make war against war itself. If Cipher is the incarnation of understanding and fighting of war, and the nuclear detonations were the continuation of war to a horrific point, then it makes sense that Pixy would turn against both you and war. The target group that he selects is in fact very much the cause, something I have said already. Balkanization, in the literal sense. The division of humans into various tribes, into nations with competing interests, separated by borders. This is also what makes A World with No Boundaries my favorite antagonists since Ouroboros in Ace Combat 3. Instead of making war on behalf of a side, they have made a meta choice, to turn against that which they see as creating wars in the first place. Ouroboros saw this as the mortal bodies we lived in. A World with No Boundaries sees the nation-state as the source of the selfish political interests that make war. Missions 1 to 6 are our initial war in Ustio. Gladison is our point of no return. Inferno marks the event horizon of our war, making us carry out, either in part or in full, the leveling of Hoffnung. Then, from the detonation to final sunset, shows the war will not end cleanly. The Balkans are preparing for something else, and so is A World with No Boundaries. The final arc of missions is very special. The position of a mission taking place after the surrender of the enemy, a desperate megalith, or the cruise missile attack in Fortress Intolerance, Solg. Here instead, the final act takes place across 4 climactic missions. Talon of Ruin pits us against Espada and the XBO, the return of Ace Combat 1's Flying Super Fortress, the first super weapon in Ace Combat as a series, and who perhaps, this is just me guessing, has something oddly familiar for Miyazaki fans. The round table pits us against 3 very cool squadrons depending on our choices, including Galt, a personal favorite of mine, the leader of which founded A World with No Boundaries. Then, we have the fantastic 2-part ending of Valley of the Kings, combining Megalith with a tight canyon run, chocked full of AA choke points and tight tunnel segment, all building up to the great last fight. This all builds to one of my favorite boss fights of all time, you versus Solo Wing. It's just so fucking cool. But you know why? Because it's so much more than just a simple finale. This is not Ace Combat 5, where this would be a war-obsessed bad man who would be launching a big nuke at not New York City, and you need to save the day by shooting it down for not America. No, that is for stupider video games. Pixy outright taunts us. The meaning of what he is saying is simple. When he asks us if we have found a meaning in our fight, the answer is that he rejected all 3 options. He has turned away from honor, from power, and from flexibility. He has decided to cut war out at its source. His meaning is now violently to destroy the nation and the borders which caused the differences that led to war in the first place. This is the metaphorical embodiment of understanding war. Fighting against his best friend, a soldier shocked into trying to unmake war, as a whole concept by eliminating the human construct of national separation of mankind. All deep-fried in Arthurian mythology. I mean, goddamn, this is a fucking narrative possibility of video games. This is all amplified by the fantastic pacing, arguably some of the best, right up there with Ace Combat 4. Ace Combat 0 does not follow the geographical campaign so much as it follows a philosophical campaign. So fundamentally, my love for Zero comes from 2 main elements. The story it is telling that war is complex, that people's orientations to war is, in and of itself, no such simple thing, and the way it tells that story. But depending on how you use Cipher play out that war, that the survivors who live on will remember and react to you. how they and their stories individually perceived your effect. Really, nothing embodies this more than one of my favorite things I found researching the Balkan conflicts. An American F-117 pilot was shot down over Serbia in 1999. The pilot, Dale Zelko, would later meet in person with Zoltan Dani, the Serbian anti-aircraft commander. In 2012, after getting into contact, the two men met. On the level of nations, the Serbian shootdown was a major point of pride, a point of songs and propaganda. For America, it showed that overly relying on technological advantages did have weaknesses if stretched too far. But on the human level, the two soldiers who once used lethal force against each other and for each other's nations met merely as human beings, as veterans of a shared conflict. Zoltan is now a baker, so they met and Zoltan baked. Ace Combat Zero's interviews for me seem almost too perfectly to resonate with this. On the level of nations, of ideology, we can kill. Our orientation will let us do these things. But in reality, as the humans we are, on that smaller level of the personal, how much perspective changes, how much those actions become somewhat inexcusable. So I can say pretty confidently that the reason I think Ace Combat Zero is objectively one of the best Ace Combat games is tied to what I personally respect the work a great deal for. That is, the integrity is set out on a complex journey, pace it well so that it draws your attention through its rising and falling actions, polarizing all of its parts, big and small, tone and themes, gameplay and details, towards a central point. Ace Combat 1, 2, and 4 kept things simple and fun. Really, only 3 is even close, but 3 ultimately has a story so good on its own that it could function as an independent story. Not that I would like that, as well the war in it is ultimately a cyberpunk setting. Ace Combat Zero, I think, weaves the two halves of gameplay and pacing, and narrative and story and themes together so fluidly, all while commenting on the complexities of contemporary war. Zero does so well, and it's such a well-paced descent into trying to make sense of war, of how people understand it and try to deal with it. From its ace styles, to its characters, to its assault records, all the gears are meshing, and the whole mechanism ticks toward its main point, that war is made of many versions, of many stories. This complicated thing that requires patient observation to deal with and understand. All the style, all the gameplay, all the story, all focused into channeling a meaning about modern war. A setting often occupied, but rarely explored and understood. This is the possibility of Strange Reel and of Ace Combat. Now very much, I would love to end it here, to say that all I have to say was that, but I feel I must end on a more bittersweet note. This is a scene from one of my favorite versions of my favorite Shakespearean plays, Coriolanus. In it, the veteran warrior Coriolanus has returned from battle, and is as custom to the plebs, that is, the general populace of Rome, not the patrician aristocracy, to show them his scars. Now this scene really is about Coriolanus asking a simple moral question. If you fight for a people, do you really need to then indulge them? Ultimately, in our daily lives we do not kill, we do not destroy, we don't get to fly fighter jets or drive tanks. What we do not have, we desire, and war is no exception. We want a fun version of war. We want the thrills of war, not the consequences. All the destruction without the moral restrictions. Ultimately, I'm not saying that war is such a horrible thing as to never be touched on, or never be made into a fun adventure. But it has been 13 years since Ace Combat Zero. As a whole, I can hope the next Ace Combat game might follow the pattern, that it might take full advantage of Strange Reel's open possibility to tell a fantastic war story, that it might be Ace Combat 3, or that it might be Ace Combat Zero again, but I don't have any guarantee. As a whole, the stories of war we get most often are of those for the mass audience, made for them, but I don't want those. I don't want any more Gundam Seed, and I don't want any more Ace Combat 5. What I'm trying to say is, I don't want stories for plebs. I want more of the other kind. I want more stories about Cipher. I want more stories about Coriolanus.